Hello, listeners. We are your co-hosts, Janine Bailey and Marie Quigley, for the Empower World Coaching and Leadership Podcast.
Empower World brings guests who are making a difference to the world to inspire coaches and leaders who lead with mind, heart, and soul.
Hello, and welcome to the next episode of Empower World's Coaching and Leadership Podcast. And I am so delighted to be here with the wonderful Eve Turner. Eve, welcome to our podcast. I know I've been wanting to get you on board for quite some time, and now here you are. So I'm very, very delighted and I feel very privileged to have you here. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
And very briefly, I'll just share the way that I met Eve was initially through Damien Goldvarg's coaching supervision program, where Eve came on for a session. And I remember it being very insightful and very informative. And I thought, what a wonderful woman and supervisor. And I would really, really be keen to work with her. And of course, time went on. And through that training, I got invited to join the Climate Coaching Alliance 24-hour conversation, which went across the various different time zones across the world. So I decided to join in Australia time, which was where I was at that time in 2020. And I joined Eve's session. And through that session, Eve and I got to be able to speak one-to-one, which was a delight once again. And Eve, I really thank you for the invitation to join the CCA at that stage, be a part of setting up Australasia, meeting the wonderful Josie and Alison, your co-conspirators, let's say, of the CCA, which was very important because at that stage, Australia was experiencing incredible bushfires, and of course, the climate change was getting the talk was getting much more fierce. So it was really important for me to be part of that. So I really thank you for that. So you're hearing from me a little bit about Eve's background, but I'd love to hand over to you, Eve, to share with our audience your background, because I know there's so many different facets to what you offer to the world. So,
Thanks, Janine. And actually, I'd love to talk a little bit later about how you've got involved in some of the work we've done together. But I suppose I've always had, if I think back to being a child, one of the things I remember most is this sense of things of justice and injustice. So that's something I remember from very young. I don't think that's that unusual. I think, young people do, and children have that sense. And I think that's sort of played out throughout my life in different ways, and probably links to climate change, but it links to all sorts of other things, including ethics. My first career was as a musician. I was a classical guitarist, and I was doing a degree in music in London, and that was fantastic. And I used to sit in my room and practice 6 hours a day, and that, which you have to do. If you want to be a reasonable musician on your instrument, you have to practice. Unfortunately, there's no shortcut. And I did that for quite a few years, and I was doing my degree. But there was just a point at which I thought, this isn't the life I want, because even though it was possible I could have had a career as a classical guitarist, possible, I mean, not definite. There was something for me about feeling quite lonely, sitting in my room, practicing. And also, classical guitar isn't an orchestral instrument. So it wasn't like I was going off to rehearsals and meeting my mates in the orchestra. So in that sense, it was perhaps not the best instrument for me. So at some stage, through working on classical music programs on radio, I then ended up working for the BBC, and eventually became a journalist, which I can't really tell you how that came about, except that I was very annoying, because the news editor in the radio station I was working in had a very clear view about people had to be trained as journalists, and so he wasn't going to use me as a journalist. But I was so annoying that after my shift every day, I would go into the newsroom and say, please let me do stories. So he used to take stories off the spike. So there's a spike in a newsroom, which is where you put stories you're not going to cover because you haven't got the resources or you don't think they're that good as stories. He'd take one off the spike and say, well, go and see what you make of that then. So I did. So my afternoons, having worked from 6 till 2, I'd go out in the afternoon and cover stories. And in the end, he started using them. So ultimately, I did become a journalist, and I had a wonderful career in the BBC, which I was very proud to be part of. And that lasted for many years, and ended up with running a division with about 250 staff. But also, what was important then was I trained as an internal coach. And when being an internal coach was, it was a fantastic opportunity because the BBC training was really top notch. And it included things like supervision, regular CPD. You had to be part of a group so that you'd get together and you'd talk about things. You do continuing practice. So you didn't just train, you carried on with the support system. So that was like the bridge to the next career. So what would I say about all those things? I think I've always had the sense that the whole is always more than the sum of the parts. And I can particularly see that, say, in an orchestra, because I had to conduct an orchestra once. And you see that. I wasn't very good at conducting, by the way, because I'd never played an orchestral instrument. So the orchestral team had to help me. But that sense that there are all these different parts going on, and then somehow they come together, and it's just amazing. And I've always had that sense of the sum being more than the whole, the whole being more than the sum of the parts. And I suppose that leads to an interest in systemic work and how things all connect together. So that's quite a long explanation, but that's how I got to where I am now. And I just love what I do: supervision, coaching, writing, research, and meeting wonderful people like you. I mean, it's just been a fantastic, a fantastic career, really.
Oh, thank you, Eve, for sharing your really fascinating background. And we had a chat beforehand, and so I was learning this about you, and I just thought, wow, that is incredible how you've had these varied experiences, but how they all come together and support what you do now. And I can absolutely resonate with that, although my journey is a little bit different. But certainly I started off in studying accounting, which is just so not me, and working in finance industry, working in recruitment. But ultimately, like you, having that little voice as a little girl, that that there was things weren't fair for many, and wanting to do something about that. In fact, I do remember thinking maybe I should be a politician. Maybe I can influence the world that way. But I haven't gone down that path. But to then be able to get to that point of listening to my values and what connects or what inspires me, like you were sharing earlier, Eve, with me, that being a musician is quite a solitary career, and you knew that there was, you wanted to connect with people. So I felt that too. But I know, Eve, you've done also set up some incredible organizations in support of coaches. So the GSN and also the CCA. I'm using acronyms, but I'll hand over to you to share maybe a little bit more about those two organizations, because what I really appreciate is that you do so much. Even I don't know how you do it, but you also have set up these organizations, and more than those two, to be able to support outwardly, upwardly, to create a better world. So say a little bit more about those organizations that you've absolutely had a hand in setting up, inspired to set up.
Thank you. I think personally that we all sort of do better when we're in community, when we work with others. So for me, working with others, connecting, is such an important part of our work. And actually, if we can only connect, if we can listen without judgment, what coaches do, just hear other people's views, etc., that sort of connection, that setting up of community, I think is so important to our world. And when we don't listen, when we do judge or rush to judge, I think things go wrong. And we're talking in 2025, and there are all sorts of challenges. Of course, there are in our world. So I don't want to be simplistic about it, but I think what you said is so important. We need to hold on to our values and work within our values. And I think I would say that underpinning that to me is that ethics is the heart of everything we do. So if I had to say one word that tied everything together, it would be the ethical ground on which we will stand, which does include things like our values. So for me, there's always been a question, what is mine to do? And I think that question is different for everybody, because there's, for me, definitely not one answer. So, for example, setting up the Climate Coaching Alliance with Josie McLean and Ali Wybrow in 2019, we were all so clear that we wanted people to join regardless of what they knew or didn't know. Everyone was welcome. Come in, talk, find out things. We had the echo phase cycle, which has been used a lot. And maybe we can put a link to it for people with the podcast. But just start by being curious, finding things out, learning more, getting information. But there's no expectation that anybody will do any particular thing. So at one end of the cycle, there's activism, but that's not for everybody. And also, what does activism mean? Because I would say I'm quite active, but I may not be active in the way that some people think of as activism. So for me, it would be through writing. It would be through talking to people, through workshops, through research. But for me, it wouldn't be demonstrating on the streets, for various reasons. But I think we all have to do what's right for us and find our own way. And so that was always the case with the Climate Coaching Alliance. And I love that you remember the bonkers idea we had in March 2020. We'd only just set up the CCA. And I think I had this idea, and Ali thought, oh, great idea. Let's go through every time zone in 24 hours and do that. And it was wonderful, because of course we had people who were taking part all across the world. So that was lovely. So that sense of community, establishing community, has always been really important. You mentioned the Global Supervisors Network, and that really came about because for supervision, there wasn't really a lot of ongoing professional development. There was quite a lot in coaching, but at the time, and I set it up, I was thinking about it in 2015, you couldn't really you could do your training, but after your training, there was a little bit of a gap. And so the Global Supervisors Network was really to say, let's provide our own ongoing learning and development, because there are all these amazing supervisors in the world. Let's all come together. And then we all have different areas of expertise, etc., etc. So let's sort this out for each other. And in the early days, when there were maybe 30, 40 members, the idea that was everyone would have to do something. But actually now there are over 400 members. So, people are probably never going to have to do anything. But it's a fantastic community. Again, it brings people together. And I suppose the last community that I think is a really important one and relates perhaps to how people would see our profession. So often there are all these professional bodies, we can talk about APAC, the IAC, the EMCC, the ICF, APEX, and so on. But people often see them as almost competitive with each other. They have their own accreditation systems or credentialing systems. But what would it be like if we all got together and said, let's work to something greater than us? And what is now called the SCC, the Sustainability Coaching Coalition, is a collection of 13 signatories, which includes some of the largest professional bodies in the world, from coaching psychology, supervision, and mentoring. And what we're doing is looking at not just climate change, because climate change, when people talk about climate change, it's not really, it's an end product of other decisions we've made. It's not an end in itself. We make decisions around economics, around health, around social equity. And as a result of those sort of choices, we end up with climate change because we decide we can use the Earth's resources and we can use them infinitely. It doesn't matter if the Earth can't renew within a year what we take in a year, we can just use the resources indefinitely. So this idea of coming together, and climate change was an area that really none of the professional bodies had looked at in any deep way. I mean, of course, people in all those bodies had been thinking about it, but it was still relatively new as a concept for the bodies. There was a lot going on in 2019. I mean, you've mentioned what was going on in Australia and the wildfires. But there's so much that's gone on across the world, whether it's floods, etc. And then there was a letter in July 2019, which was called an open letter to the coaching profession, which was actually saying, are we going to stand up and say, what do we need to do about this as a profession? So the SCC, what's now the Sustainability Coaching Coalition, has become something that looks at those areas and looks at it within a lens of social justice, equity, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And that's interesting, because some people might say, is that the role of coaching? Is it the role of supervision, mentoring, coaching psychology? And I suppose my question has been, what is our role? It's not to tell people what it is, but is our role to sustain things in the sense of business as usual, to keep things as they are, when we know, back to our childhoods and this sense of injustice and fairness, when we know that things aren't fair and there's not a real justice for a lot of people in the world. There are large parts of the world, particularly the global south, which have been hugely impacted by climate change, and yet they've not been involved in creating it. It's been through actions taken by countries in the global north. So I think the SCC, which is, as I say, 13 signatories, that's an important area, and that's very active now, roundtables, etc. And I think that's to be encouraged, because I think the more we can work together, the more we can do things. It's all about connection.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Eve, for sharing. And you certainly answered the question that I was going to bring in relation to some coaches may say, do I need to take on that responsibility? And for me, what I learned in my coach training is to support people to make ecological decisions. Is it good for self?
Yeah.
Is it good for their immediate circle, system? Is it good for the greater good? Is it good for ultimately planet Earth? And that's what I learned when I
Mm,
started coaching. And I thought that was brilliant because it was a way for me not to be the expert, but a way for in terms of people's decision making, but it was a way for people to check in themselves. Is it good for me? Is it good for others? Is it good for the greater good? And that's what I loved about coaching. That's what I love that, we get to support people to make decisions that look at the systemic impact of their choices and to really check in, is it is it
mm.
really a decision that is good for all of us? So yeah, so thank you for answering that. And I'm sure that that is a question that might come up for some. Is Do I need to be concerned about these
Yeah.
greater
And
good?
I think it's very important because we are, we understand that it's not for us to impose an agenda on people. I suppose my view is that there's the work, if you were my client and I was your coach, there's the work we need to do. What is the work we need to do together? Um, and so I tend to see it in a systemic way, the work that's needed rather than what you want or what I want, but what actually are we being called to do? What is this situation asking of us? And so that tends to be how I would see that. But it would never be about saying to somebody, what do you think of climate change? I think that wouldn't to me be appropriate.
Mm.
I I think when it comes to things like contracting, which to me has always been something I've felt was hugely important in our work, um, then one of the things we might consider is what's the world you want to leave behind? So that might be one thing. It might be thinking about future generations, because I think if we ignore future generations, and I think sometimes business decisions do, they may look to the next 10 to 20 years for strategy. But what about for our collective grandchildren and great grandchildren? What's the world we want to leave behind? If we can see it in that lens, if we think about how are trends changing, you know, where will our future customers, where will our future staff come from? What are their interests? What do they want from life, which might be different from what people wanted 10, 20, 30 years ago? I think there are ways of bringing this up that are um, quite within, I would say, an ethical frame. Um, so that's how I would do it. Um, and I think that the connector for a lot of people is around thinking of future generations, and sometimes it's very personal. It's about my child and my grandchild and my great grandchild, but actually, it is about the collective too. What do we need to do? What do we need to do to be a good ancestor? I mean, there's a wonderful book by Roman Krasnich called The Good Ancestor. What do we need to do to be good ancestors? Because I was listening to a talk last week by Kate Raworth and Rowan Krasnich, and Kate Raworth, who wrote about donut economics, said we're the only species on the planet that's actually desecrating, this is what she said, our own nest. Most species look after their nest, they look after where they live, but actually we're not. We're in
Mm.
danger of desecrating our nest.
Mm.
So that there's a lot for us to think about, but be careful about how we introduce it.
Mm. Yes, that is beautifully shared, Eve, in terms of how we can incorporate um, or ask our clients to reflect on the systemic impact of their choices, and bringing that in at the contracting stage is I believe really powerful. And that's certainly something that I learnt when I was very much involved in um, training Indigenous Maori Pacifica women and men to become coaches, and therefore coaching
Yeah.
one-to-one as well. So, and it became very apparent for me that that is important to ask those questions in terms of the future. What's the legacy that you want to leave behind? Um, and of course, Maori are very connected to the land, the sky, the sea. So that really heightened that awareness for me, and how I contract with all my clients from that point on with that awareness, but also, having the opportunity to join the CCA, the Climate Coaching Alliance, and, being able to come along to so many wonderful sessions that were offered through the CCA and continue to be offered. So there's just so many different ways that we can support our clients without imposing our perspective, but actually making it a choice for our clients to decide what is good for them. Yeah. So I really appreciate, Eve, those three different communities that you have built, that you have supported, that you have. I know it's been a collaborative effort with
Mm.
some wonderful coaches and leaders in our profession. Um, so, and I have really appreciated the opportunity to be part of the CCA and the GSN, the Global Supervision Network, as well as a volunteer. Um, so again, just yeah, huge appreciation. So Eve, I know we've talked for a little bit here, but as we come to this point, what are you perhaps starting to notice through our conversation that perhaps is important to share with our listeners about how we show up, who we are, how we can potentially contribute, or maybe it's something else. I'm just curious as to what might be coming up for you right now.
Oh, it's really interesting what you just say. I think as I've got older, and maybe this is the relaxation of being older, um, but I felt I don't want to hide anymore. I, I'm not saying I ever really hid. That's not quite it. But I think I'm very open with people now about who I am and what I care about. Um, that sometimes in coach training there's this idea that you leave yourself outside the door. Well, how can you? You take into the coaching room everything that you are and everything you care about. Um, so um, so yes, I've really valued thinking about that, and how important it is to be truthful about who you are, what you care about. That's not because you want to impose. I have a large supervision practice, and I don't spend lots of time talking about myself in that. But when I'm talking to potential supervisees, I'll be very clear about some of the things that are important to me. I care about systemic working. I care about equity and climate change. Just being clear, these are things I care about. I'm not so. It won't be so much about the techniques, and these are the tools I use. It will be much more about the the bigger picture. And as I say, maybe that's just as you get older, I felt freed up to do that. Um, and I'm realistic. Um, I think when I was younger and I needed to pay a mortgage, I was more concerned about things like that. But now, yes, just being open and clear about who I am. And I love what you've said too, Janine, about not only the training you've had, because I think when you've talked about having a training which has looked at the eco world, that's actually quite unusual for when you were being trained. And then the interest that's taken you to work with Indigenous people, I mean, where did that come from? Because I'm fascinated by that. Because it's obviously really important to you too.
Mm. Yeah, it really is. And thank you for asking. I when I was when I began my coach training with my business partner Marie Quigley in Qatar, we were very fortunate to attract a very diverse community into our training rooms and people from all around the world. So Qatar is known for its very diverse population, and so very very fortunate. I was able to train and coach, mentor, and supervise people from all around the globe, really. And one of the which again really met my values of wanting to support people to bring out their best, to be able to work with many people from different countries and cultures, which something I knew as a young girl um, that I wanted to do. So I was meeting those values many decades later, but I met a wonderful Maori woman who joined our training. She was a friend of mine, and I invited her to join, and she did. And it was through that training that she created this vision to go back to New Zealand and to carry on a tradition of her grandmother, certainly, who was very instrumental in bringing back or retrieving let's land for Maori. She had a huge influence in making that happen. And so Rachel decided that she wanted to go back to New Zealand to empower 100,000 women by 2025. That was back in 2014 or 15. So, and she said, I have created this vision, and Janine, I'd like you to partner with me to make that happen. So it's because I knew, or she knew, that I was going back to Australia to also live more permanently. And so it was easy for us to connect and for me to go over to New Zealand and partner with her to train these women, these wonderful, amazing women. Um, and it was such a humbling and amazing experience that I'll never, ever forget. I feel quite emotional now as I think about it. Um, because the Maori, they really do believe in themselves and believe in their culture, which is so grounded again in the earth, the sky, the sea, the people, the traditions. It was just such a privilege to be able to experience that. And the reason I think that it really connected to with me was that we also wanted to train Indigenous Australians as well. And I have two aunts who are Aboriginal, and two of my dad's brothers married to Aboriginal aunts. And they had been essentially, they, through their upbringing, had lost their traditions and their ways of connecting to their source and their culture. And so for me, that was, yeah, really not, in my view, correct. Um, there's probably a better way to say that, but yeah. So that sense of justice came through. Being able to do something about that somehow, some way, in my own small way with Rachel was something that really meant the world to me. So that's the history, the background of how I got involved in that and why it's so important and why I'm so passionate about it. And even though they've become interdependent, so we've trained coaches, Maori coaches who now do the training. So I've been able to step away. I'm still a little bit involved, supporting certainly Rachel in different ways, but yeah, it's I've stepped away sadly, but I'm also so delighted that they've created their own program that is ICF approved, which brings in their cultural ways of being and doing, which is incredible and a fantastic achievement.
It is a fantastic achievement, and I was so thrilled and grateful when you wrote about that for our book on which is just here ecological and climate conscious coaching because it it is so remarkable and actually very moving. I mean, you say you're moved, but I actually quite move when I think back to some of the um I, songs. I don't know what you'd call them, songs that they use. I mean, it was just so beautiful and very meaningful. And thank you for being involved.
Yeah, thank you for the reminder, Eve. I had had forgotten about that. So really, and it was a again a real privilege to be asked to contribute in that way and be able to share the success of what Rachel has created and continues to build upon to support Indigenous globally, not just locally, but globally. So she's really making a wonderful difference. So it's lovely to have been involved in it in that small way for me. So yeah.
And in a way, it sort of comes back to we can all do what we can do in the way that we do it that's right for us. So we can all contribute. We just find the way that's right for us to do so.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Eve. As we wrap up our conversation today, I'd love it to continue. But I know that we must wrap up shortly. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience? I know that we'll send them your contact details and the links to the various things that we've shared, and perhaps even the books that you've got behind you. I know we haven't touched on those either. But is there anything else that you'd like to share before we close out?
I'm I'm just very grateful for the opportunity to talk about these things. And I think I what I'd share is that without pressure, there's always something that we can do. We're so good as coaches at not just asking questions, because that's a bit of what we do, but of being with people, of sitting with people, of just in presence of, um, and support people. And I'm reminded of Josie McLean does a lot of work, as you know, in Australia, and she was working with a particular team, and she gave them the opportunity to talk about. It was meant to be a strategy discussion, but to talk about what was the world they wanted to leave behind, and it was like an opening up for people, an opportunity that they really didn't often get to think about the things that were most important to them. And I think that I that's something that we can all do, give people an opportunity to think about the things that are really important to them. Not just the strategy and how we're going to earn more money over the next 10, 20 years, but for all of them in this team, what's the world we want to leave behind? And I know it's been very moving when she's worked with people in that way and how much they've appreciated it. So we can all give people that opportunity.
Yes, and coaching, as you say, I mean, of course, we can ask that question in a non-coaching conversation, um,
Yeah.
and in a coaching conversation, as you say, offer that presence and that ability to be really heard and seen and acknowledged.
Mm.
Know that what they share is absolutely honored and 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 sacred. It's a wonderful opportunity for people to be authentic and reach into and tap into what is truly, truly important.
Yeah, beautifully said. Thank you.
Mm. I'm just feeding off what you've shared, Eve. So thank you, Eve. It's been an absolute pleasure and delight to have this conversation with you, and I trust our listeners will have taken away so much value from what you shared, and we hope that some of our listeners can join us in these various different spaces and places that you've created, Eve, and so much more. So thank you. Very grateful.
Thank you, Julian. It's been lovely.
Thanks for listening. You can find out more about us on our website www.empower-world.com and on our social media networks Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram and YouTube. Be empowered.